stop. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. You never stop. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. You never stop. You never stop working.
Welcome to FFBC Online. We're so glad you could join us today. In fact, why don't you take a moment right now to invite a friend? You can text them, message them. It could be a neighbor, coworker, family member, so they could worship with us as well. Also, don't forget to take advantage of the live chat function to the bottom right of your screen. You can be chatting with people right during the service and commenting. That's great. And you can also take advantage of the live prayer section towards the bottom middle of your screen. If you have a prayer request, someone will discreetly see that and answer that and start praying with you right away. So please take advantage of that. Also, don't forget, you can use our website to give online. It's nearing the end of the financial year, and it's just a great opportunity to support all the work that we do, partnering with God locally and around the world. And so that's a great thing. As you might be aware, things are changing constantly in our environment, which means we could possibly be going back to having services live on our site on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights. So please keep aware of our Facebook page on our website and check for details. And even when we do go live, we will also be doing our services online, streaming them online every Sunday, so you can still take part of that. Why don't I just pray right now? God, we just thank you that you love us so much, and God, that you're here with us in our midst, whether we're watching this in our car, on our lounge rooms, or with family and friends. And so God, we just ask that you would help us to learn more about you today, help us to grow closer to you, and help us to just really worship you in spirit and in truth. And God, we just surrender all the circumstances around us and when we'll go back on site together. We surrender all that to your hands and just ask that your will be done in Jesus' name.
powerful name, it is the name of Jesus. There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my dead left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? Either way, I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding, power sets me free. There is a grave that holds no body. Now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. There is another in the I can see the light in the darkness, as the darkness bows to Him. I can hear the roar in the heavens, as the space between moves in. I can feel the ground shake beneath us, as the prison walls begin. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. And I know I will never be alone. Be another in the fire, standing next to me. Be another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of what you've been the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be.
2020, what a year. It's got to be one of the most disruptive years that I can ever remember. And maybe you feel the same way. It's a year in which everything sort of looks different, from the way we interact to where we work to how we work. And even things that we took for granted or we take for granted, things like traveling or gathering together or going out for a meal, gathering together for a church service. All those things look slightly different this year. And then there's the issue for people of faith, that in the midst of all this, you ask questions like, is there something that God wants me to see? Is there a new perspective that God is bringing to the way in which I engage the world or view the world? Is there something going on here? I remember, would have been my early 20s when I first got glasses. And I knew I needed glasses because there's sure signs that my sight wasn't right. Apart from the strain to my eyes, I'd get headaches and nausea. And so I had to go for the dreaded eye test. And I had to put that big thing on. I think it's called a phoropter, and it's got all these lenses in it. If you've ever done it, you know what I'm talking about. And when you get your eyes tested, it's quite a challenging test. It's not a challenging test from an intellectual point of view. It's a challenging test because you don't want to get it wrong. And if you've ever done it, they have a series of lenses that they click through, and they ask you the question, is this clearer or this clearer? Or this clearer or is this clearer? And you really don't know. They go, click, click. That one clearer? That one clearer. And you go, I don't know. I think it was the right one. And then they do it again. Clearer, clearer. Maybe the first one. And there's part of you that wants to say, can't you just tell me? Can't you just give me the answer? Because that's a problem with the test, that there's no right answer. They don't give you the set of answers at the end. You can find out how you went. Because the reality is they can't tell you. All they can do is they provide a circumstance, an environment, a way for me to be able to see more clearly. And so they run through a series of lenses and ask me, is this making things clearer or not? The strange thing about sight is when your sight's bad, or before you get glasses, you don't often know how bad your sight is. Everything seems fine, and then when you get glasses on, there's this remarkable moment where things that are blurry, all of a sudden you realize that they're meant to be sharp, and there are details there in objects that you didn't even know were there before. The strange thing about sight is you don't realize how bad your sight is until somebody gives you a new set of lenses that bring clarity to what's going on, to what you're seeing. And interesting thing about, I think, life and vision, it's not always lenses or glasses that help us see clearer. Sometimes in life there can be a change of circumstances, perhaps like we're going through right now. But we go through these moments where circumstances changes, or we go through a challenge, and all of a sudden, the end of the challenge or the moment, we see things far more clearly than we did before. There have been many times in my life where I thought I saw things clearly, and then somebody will say something, or they'll act in a particular way, or a circumstance will change, and I'll have this moment where I realize, oh, I'm not seeing it as clearly as I thought I was. And so that's really what I want to talk about today as we continue our series in the book of Nehemiah, is how do you see things clearly? What choices do you need to make? What choices can we make that when we think that God, and particularly in the context of faith, when we feel like God is giving us something to see, He's giving us a vision, what choices can I make, or can we make, that will help us see more clearly? And then how can we perhaps help others see more clearly? In Nehemiah chapter 2, we have this moment where Nehemiah experiences that. He arrives in Jerusalem and he's got this vision of what he wants to do, but it needs to be refined, it needs to be sharpened, and he then needs to help others see what he sees. I mean, the last time we saw Nehemiah, just prior to this section, he's sort of in the palace, he's high-fiving people, he's punching the air. He's just met with the king, and the king is giving him everything that he asked for. He's got provisions, he's got protection, he's got power. And so he can go and actually, he's got all the authority, all the things he needs to go and rebuild the wall in Jerusalem, rebuild the city walls and the gates and the like, and just repair the city in Jerusalem. If you're not familiar with the story of Nehemiah, just a bit of a recap is that Nehemiah is this guy's cupbearer to the king, King Artaxerxes of Persia. Nehemiah himself is growing up in Persia, but he's a Jew by race and by culture. And at the very start of the book, he gets news from Israel that Jerusalem and his countrymen and the place that his fathers and forefathers lived in is in an utter state of disrepair. The walls are torn down in Jerusalem, the gates are being burned. The city is a mess. It's not new news, it's been like this for 140 years, but perhaps he was hoping that it would be different. And when he hears this news, it absolutely breaks him. He's so distressed that he can't eat. He's so distressed that he actually just cries out to God. He confesses his sin and the sin of his forefathers. And then he asks God to intervene. He asks God for an opportunity to bring this circumstance to the attention of the king and asks that God will give him success in his request to get the king involved. And when he prays that prayer, it's some 4 months later that he finally gets an opportunity for this to occur. And when it occurs, he's before the king and he tells the king about the plight of his people. He asks the king for the resources that he would need, for the power that he would need, for the protection that he would need. And to everybody's surprise, the king grants his request. And there's like this only God moment. And so 4 months have passed since then. He's got permission from the king. He's got his troops together that are going to be his entourage and protect him along the way. He's got all the resources he needs. And he's traveled all the way from Susa to Jerusalem, some 1,000 miles. And now that he's at the edge of the city, the question is, how will this go? He doesn't know how it will go. He can't know how it will go. He wants to rebuild the walls of a city where he's never seen the walls, and he's trying to get the support of people that he's never met. And there's this uncomfortable moment that this grand vision that seems so clear back in Susa, when he gets to the edge of Jerusalem, it seems a little more blurry. He's not so certain about it. And what ought he do? And sometimes the temptation is we get to the edge of something and we feel like I've got everything that I need. I feel like God's in. I want to rush ahead and just get it done. But there's something in Nehemiah that seems to suggest that that's not what he ought to do. And so he's trying to bring clarity to what does God want him to do and what is the next step. He has to make some choices. And the story picks up in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. This is what it says. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, because as yet I'd said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. It's a strange sort of unexpected moment. He turns up and he tells nobody what he's doing. And it begs the question, why? You know, he's got the protection of the king. He's got all the resources he needs. He's come with the confidence that he's got the favor of God. And yet he comes incognito. When he rides in, he rides around, it's on a single mount. He should have an entourage with him. He should have protection around him, but he doesn't bring any of that. He tells no one what is going on. And I think the answer is he's not ready to share his vision yet. Because when he arrives, he makes a really, really strategic decision. Listen again to verse 11. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days. So for 3 days, he sits around and does nothing. When somebody comes dressed as a Persian official, I'm sure it piques the interest of those that live in the city. And so I'm sure there's all sorts of questions about who is he this stranger, what's he doing here? And so for 3 days, he sits there and does nothing. I guess he's waiting for the interest to wane a little bit. And then after 3 days, he sneaks out at night. He goes around the walls, he looks at the walls, he he pokes around. He can even find spots that are so in such a state of disrepair you can't even ride a horse through them. And what is he doing? He's gathering data. He's gathering information. He's getting a sense of what is the city really like. If he's got this God-given vision to do something here, he wants to understand. That's part of the process. If you want to understand the city, you've got to literally, in a sense, walk around the walls, or figuratively walk around the walls. And if God's giving you a call for this city, for your city, for our city, if he's stirring something in you, if you're trying to get clarity on that vision that he might have for you, that call he has for you, do you walk around the walls? Do you try to get a sense of what's going on here? For us, it's not literally walking around the walls, but it's maybe going around and poking and prodding and asking questions, looking at the structures of the city. What sort of buildings are there in this area, and what are they used for? What are the signs that are up, and the signage? Who does it cater for? What sort of people is it aimed at? What's the purpose of the signs in this community? The places of worship. You look at the places of worship in the community and say, who attend? What types of places of worship are they? Who attends? How many people attend those? What about public spaces? Where do people gather? And when they gather, do they like private spaces? Do they like wide open spaces? What are the interests that are reflected in the community? It's trying to get to know the community, trying to understand. If God's called you here, He's called us here, it's a sense in which we're walking around and saying, I'm trying to understand this place. And that's what Nehemiah is doing. He's trying to understand. He's heard about it. He knows it in broad strokes what needs to get done, but he doesn't really understand. So for 3 days, he sits around and he listens. He hears the stories. He's incognito. He's probably asking questions. He wanders around the walls at night. Mike Frost and Christina Rice in their book, To Order the World, they make this observation that we need to really wander around and ask these sorts of questions to get to know our city if we really want to engage it. And in their book, they make this comment. As we learn more about our place, we become conduits of goodness and grace, holding the space for God's Spirit to birth redemptive realities and build hope. We connect people in need with the resources that could best serve them. We cultivate gathering spaces that nurture human connection. We tell people about Jesus. You hear what they're saying. It's the experience of Nehemiah. It's not just about gathering data. It's actually trying to understand the people and how do we connect with them and what are their needs. When Nehemiah walks around the city, he sees the burned gates and the broken walls, but I think he's also understanding this is a city that's lost its sense of purpose and its destiny and its identity. It's lost its sense of pride about who it is and what it ought to be about. And so what he does is he understands that, hey, before he talks about this vision, he's got to walk the city. And sometimes we've got to walk before we talk. We need to walk around and try to understand the place that God's called us to, gather the data, ask the questions, get a sense of what this place is about. Jesus, when talking to his disciples about the cost of discipleship in Luke, said these words. Luke 14:28. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? In other words, what Jesus is saying is, get the facts before you start. Gather the data, do the homework, walk around the proverbial wall, and weigh up the cost of what it's going to be involved to do what God is calling you to do. And sometimes when you do that, here's the risk. Sometimes when you do that, you're going to feel overwhelmed. When you sit back and think about the enormity of what God often calls us into, it seems impossible. It seems overwhelming. And if you feel overwhelmed and yet still compelled to go forward, I think that's a good thing. It means you're not just running off emotions. It's not just that you were just inspired by somebody's great speech or talk. It wasn't just somebody you read or you want to be like somebody else. It means that God's actually stirring something in you. That even though you know the cost, you're prepared to do it. The other thing that waiting does is it gives you time to bring clarity to what it is that God is calling you to do, as you start to assess it, as you get a sense of what the city is like, as you walk before you talk, you get clarity. Because the moment you talk, here's the interesting thing, the moment you talk, you open yourself up to criticism. The moment you talk, you get the inevitable how question. And as we talked about last week, so often we know the what before we know the how. And you start talking about it, particularly if you're an external processor or a little activistic. And I got to admit, I struggle with this one at times. I get an idea and I want to start talking about it. I want to start processing it. And I figure, hey, we'll figure this out along the way. And sometimes that works, but sometimes the more prudent action is to slow down, to just spend time with God alone, to walk before you talk, to assess the cost, to wait, to check that, hey, this is definitely from God. I still feel the stirring. I still feel compelled about this. And that which is a little fuzzy is becoming clearer and clearer. Because there'll become a point where you have to share with somebody and they'll ask the questions. And if you don't have the clarity yet, you make it harder for them and you may well lose them. And so Nehemiah walks before he talks. And then he gets ready to talk. And it's really interesting what he chooses to say when he does talk. Listen again to Nehemiah chapter 2. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and we'll no longer be in disgrace. I told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. If you feel God stirring something in you, you wait and investigate and take time and allow God to bring some clarity to you. But if God's stirring something in you, if you're feeling a burden, there's a very good chance that you won't be alone in this. That he may well be stirring this in somebody else. And there'll come a time when you'll need to talk about it. And you need to take a risk and you won't know how they're going to react. You don't know how they're going to feel. You don't know if they feel the same way you do. When Nehemiah is going to talk about this, he doesn't know how they feel about the walls. Maybe they've just become accustomed to it. It's just the way things are. Maybe they could care less about it. He doesn't know, but he knows that God has put this on his heart. And so he's taken the time to check that. He's taken the time to make sure it's from God. He's got some clarity about how he's going to explain this. And then he starts in a really strategic way. He identifies the problem. He identifies the thing that everybody must know. He says, here is the problem. Listen again to verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. The walls have torn down, the gates have been burned. It's not new information. I imagine when Nehemiah told them, they already knew this, and perhaps they would have been a little offended by it. And yet, when somebody outside says it, even if you're offended by it, it stirs something in you and you start to see things once again through the eyes of somebody else. Sometimes Nehemiah comes along and it's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call to what we've ignored or what we've got used to. Just about every church that I visit or I've been part of sees themselves as friendly. And all too often, the sad truth is we're not as friendly as we think we are. I'm not saying that we're rude. I don't think most churches are rude, but so often people will come and they're not necessarily welcome when they come to churches as much as churches would like to think they are. And we rationalize it. Sometimes we assume somebody else is doing it or we say, I don't want to overwhelm the new person. I want to give them some space. Sometimes our post-service gatherings are so full of conversations that we assume that everybody's enjoying a conversation like we are. But the reality is we're actually talking to the same people we talk to every week. And then along comes a Nehemiah type and says, hey, you're not as friendly as you think you are. And we get a little offended. When somebody says it about your church, you feel offended. But then I reckon what tends to happen, if I've ever been on the receiving end of this, or perhaps you've been on the receiving end of this, what happens is it stirs something in you when you start to look at things through the eyes of the other. And it can produce some change in you. And sometimes we need a Nehemiah to say, hey, the walls are torn down, the gates are burned with fire. And sometimes we need to be the Nehemiah to point that out. And so what happens here is that Nehemiah comes along, and when he talks, he says, okay, let me tell you the problem. It's a problem you can all see. And I know you might be offended that I'm bringing it up, but this is the reality. But then he doesn't leave it there. When he talks, after he's doing his investigation, he says, here's the problem. And then he goes on to say, and here's the solution. Verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. When you think about it, it's not rocket science, is it? I mean, the solution isn't all that complex. The walls are being destroyed. Let's rebuild the walls. The gates are being burned with fire. Let's replace the gates. It's not that difficult. And to be honest, I don't think all solutions are always that simple. Sometimes a little more complex. We need to think them through. And maybe in that period of waiting, when you're discerning, when you're listening, when you're getting clarity from God, when you're trying to understand the lay of the land, I wonder sometimes in those moments when it's just you and God, that He can bring clarity to the vision, that He can simplify it, that we can explain it to somebody else in a way that is helpful, because this vision, as Nehemiah full well knows, isn't his alone. This vision that God has birthed in him is actually for the community, and he needs to invite others along. And if it's unclear to him, if he can't explain it simply, how on earth will they ever understand? And so there's an important thing here where he identifies the problem and then he offers a solution, but he offers a very, very simple solution. He's not simplifying, he's just bringing clarity to what it is that God is doing, because he wants people to be on board. He doesn't want to baffle them. And so if God's stirring something new, first get that clarity, spend time, walk before you talk. But when you talk, identify the problem, provide the solution. And then the third thing that Nehemiah does is he gives people the reason we ought to do this. He writes again in verse 17, then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and the gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we'll no longer be in disgrace. I think the why really matters. He's saying to them, I want to give you the reason why we're doing this. And he says, first of all, we're in trouble. And it's a way of saying the city is actually defenseless. We're vulnerable. We're surrounded by enemies, and if they want to get us, we've got no way to protect the inhabitants of the city. That's one reason why. But he says also, we're a disgrace. We're meant to be a city which has this temple that worships God. We're meant to be the people of God. We have this particular distinctive, this call on our life to be a light to the nations, to reveal the glory of God. And he's saying, we're a disgrace. We're an embarrassment to God. If this is the best that God can do with his capital and where the temple is, then we've lost our sense of purpose and identity. And he says, we need to rediscover who we are and what we're about. And that's what the reason does. It reconnects people back to why do we need to do this? And in a sense, that's our same why. Our methodology might not be to rebuild a wall, but to be a people who make God known and represent God to this city, to be his people in this place. It's a similar sort of call. And so why do we be open, inclusive communities? Because this is God that loves humanity, has these an intrinsic worth and value in every human being. Of course, we would make communities that are open, inclusive, would make them welcoming, that would invest not just in people when they come to visit church, but to invest in their lives. That's the reason why. It stirs our heart, but it also helps us understand why are we doing this and how to connect with God's purpose and for us and our identity in Him. Yeah, there are other things that God might be stirring. It might be simply God saying to you, I want you to raise great kids. Or He might be saying to you, what I want you to do is, I want you to care for those in need. Why? What's the reason behind it? Raise great kids so you can influence the next generation for Christ. That's why. Care for those in need so you can demonstrate in practical ways that there is a God who knows and loves all people and cares for them in really practical ways. The why matters, and the why rallies our hearts together. And so Nehemiah is saying to the people, hey, I'm here and here's the problem. I've identified the problem that we can all see, and here's the solution. This is what we need to do, and here's why we need to do it. And there's got one final question he needs to answer. The question is, why now? This city's been like this for 140 years. Why now? And listen to what he says. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. Did you notice it? There's some implied timing there. There's a sense in which, hey, God's got a timing in this. I mean, the people of Jerusalem must have felt that God had abandoned them. It would have been natural to think that after 140 years of the city lying in ruins. And then along comes the cupbearer to the Persian king, and he tells this extraordinary tale of how news about the state of the city had reached him, how he'd become distressed by it, anxious nights, how nights of prayer, how he had come before the king and made this audacious request, and how the king had responded. How the king had identified with the plight of the people of Israel, how he had released resources and power and protection for Nehemiah to do something about it. And Nehemiah is saying, here I am. And it seems like Nehemiah's story and his presence affirms that after 140 years, now is the time. Now is the time when God has aligned all this to do something about the state of this city and our nation, to reestablish us, to restore us, to rebuild the city. And furthermore, then he has the permission of the king, this little window that the king has given him to be in Jerusalem. And the king sets him there, and he sends him there with a particular reason, for one reason and one reason only, but he also gives him a really limited time frame. It's sort of hinted at early in the chapter, in chapter 2, verse 6. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Now, it's not recorded how long this is for, but it's very clear that there's sort of this agreement between the king of Persia and the cupbearer, between Artaxerxes and Nehemiah. And so as he reflects on this, I think there's a sense of urgency for Nehemiah. What he's saying is, the king's released me for this reason alone, but he's also given me a window in which I can do this. And I think he's actually doing something really, really smart here. And I think it's really key. When he's not just telling them what he wants to do or how he's going to do it or even why he needs to do it. He's saying, this is why now. God is clearly in this, and he's worked in such a way that the king has released me for a particular period of time. There's a little window that we have here. And you need to feel this, and you need to be emotionally connected to this. And you need to understand that, hey, if we don't take this opportunity, we will lose it. And so he gives them the problem. He identifies the solution. He tells them why, and now he tells them why now. He's inviting them to see what he sees, to feel what he feels, to be part of this thing which God has been stirring in him. And it begs the question, how will the people respond? Verse 18. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began his good work. Nehemiah had waited for the right time, and when he spoke, all the people got on board. And it wasn't an overnight thing. I mean, how many years have people been dreaming this, and how many years have they been yearning for this? For 4 months, Nehemiah had heard about it and prayed about it before he even got a chance to talk to the king. Then he had to arrange his supplies and organize the escort. He had to travel all the way from Susa to Jerusalem. He sat in the city for 3 days. He did a review of it one night. This wasn't like an overnight, instantaneous thing. This is something that God had been stirring in people for some time. But they required a moment, or there needed to be a moment, when Nehemiah was courageous enough to talk, to share the vision, to tell people what God had placed on his heart, and then God moved them together. There's still plenty to get done. This is not the end of the story, but a movement has begun because Nehemiah was courageous enough to speak out, to articulate the vision that was succinct and clear, and identified the problem and gave them a reason why, and gave them a reason why now. And they get on board and say, we want to be part of this. And it's so interesting how movements work. See, Nehemiah started a movement that would not just rebuild the walls, but would restore a city and an identity and a people. And Steve Addison, the guy named Steve Addison, writes this really interesting book about movements that change the world. And it's interesting, what he identifies as key to a movement is what we find that's just occurred in this story. Steve Addison writes this: movements are characterized by discontent, vision, and action. Discontent unfreezes people from their commitment to the way things are. Movements emerge when people feel something needs to change. If the vacuum created by discontent is filled with the vision of a different future and action to bring change, then a movement is born. Movements change people, and change people change the world. I love that quote. I don't know about you, but I know I want to be part of a movement. I don't want to be part of an institution. I don't want to be part of just doing the same things because they've always been done that way. I want to be part of something that God is doing. And sometimes he will stir us, and sometimes he'll give us a new sense of call or vision. Sometimes he'll awaken us to something, say, it's about time that we did something about that. And maybe God's been stirring something new. That's why this talk about vision today is so important. That if God is stirring something new, how are you going to bring clarity to that? How are you going to refine the thing that seems fuzzy at the moment? Make the choice to wait, to listen, to walk before you talk. To spend time with God, to walk around this region, this city, and ask the questions. To get a sense of the scope of this thing that God is calling you to be part of, to get clarity of thought about what exactly is it that God is asking us to do, to know the problem, to understand the solution, to feel the reason and to feel the urgency of why now, why this time. And see, if God is stirring something in you, I would argue it's probably not just for you alone, and you're probably not the only one that's feeling it. Could it be that God's stirring something in you and he's stirring the same thing in those around you? And at some point, somebody's going to have to be courageous enough to say, hey, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking. Do you think God's in this? And just discern it together. And when we talk about vision, so often it can feel overwhelming. It feels like, hey, vision or vision casting needs to be an eloquent speaker, someone with charisma in front of a large crowd, sort of rallying the troops. I don't want you, if you get caught up in that word, I want you to give you another word, an invitation or sharing. If God is stirring something in you and you spent time waiting on God, getting clarity about it, maybe just test it by talking to somebody about it. And if you've got a discontent about how our city or our region, you think, I think there's something God wants to do here. I think there's something that he wants to express. I think there's something that we need to do to represent him better, to make him known, to express his character and love better. Then maybe the vision starts with just you across a coffee table in a cafe one day sharing with a friend, or across a dinner table with your family, or in a small group in a lounge room. And just share it. If God is stirring something in you, don't ignore it. Wait and listen. Allow him to bring clarity. And in that process, sometimes he'll bring a Nehemiah alongside you. And they will say exactly what you're feeling and what you're thinking. And you'll join them with delight and say, I want to be part of that. But other times, God might be tapping you on the shoulder and saying, I want you to be the Nehemiah right now. I want you to express this and to motivate and inspire others to take heed of the thing that I've been stirring in them and to start this little movement of mine. And my prayer would be there'll be a community full of people that are either Nehemiahs or prepared to listen to Nehemiahs, that aren't prepared any longer to sit around and watch a city lay in ruins for 140 years and just get used to it and just live with the belief that somehow God has abandoned them. But to be a people who are courageous enough to recognize, hey, this angst, this yearning, this burden, that maybe it's from God and maybe I need to spend some time trying to figure this thing out. I need to hear from God in this. I need to get some clarity about what this is. And then I need to be prepared to either join somebody who's doing something like it or give expression to this thing that God has placed on my heart. And my prayer would be that a movement would start. That we would not be known as an institution, but a group of changed people who God is using to change the world.
There is a sound I love to hear. It's the sound of the Savior's robe as he walks into the room where people pray, where we hear praises, he is faith. There is a sound I love to hear. It's the sound of the Savior's robe as he walks into the room with no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began. Ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. My orphan heart was given a name. My morning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Know your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and he called me his friend. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoices though heaven had lost. But then Jesus